Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. Well, here we are, Uzumaki. I saved this one for last because it's Junji Ito's most popular work and many cite it as his best. You can be the judge of that, but either way, it just felt like a good way to end this whole series. I will be doing one more video before the mega compilation where I go over Tomie in more detail. I technically covered it in the very first video, but I didn't give it the detailed treatment that I did for every other multi-part series, so expect that next. Other than that, this is it, the final stretch. This is Junji Ito's Uzumaki, explained. Chapter 1, The Spiral Obsession, begins with a high school girl named Kirie Goshima looking over Kurozu-cho, the town she lives in. She says she wants to share with us the strange events that happened here. It seems she's late on her way to meet her boyfriend Shuichi Saito at the station. As she runs, she's suddenly hit with a gust of air as a small whirlwind comes across her path. Weird. Next, she notices a man she thinks may be Shuichi's father squatting in an alley and staring at an empty snail shell. The man's unresponsive, so she continues on her way. Kirie meets Shuichi at the station, and we learn that although he does live in Kurozu-cho, he now goes to school in the next town over. Kirie mentions that she thought she saw his father staring at the shell in the alley, and Shuichi actually confirms that it probably was his dad and that he's been acting strange lately. They sit down at the park, and Kirie wonders why Shuichi has seemed so depressed lately. Out of the blue, he tells her they should leave the town together. He says he can't stand this town and that something's off here. Because he's away from Kurozu-cho so often, it's more noticeable and has a dizzying effect on him. Ultimately, he believes the town is driving him insane and is contaminated with spirals. The next day, Shuichi's father visits Kirie's father in his shop. He's a potter, and it seems Mr. Saito wants him to make a spiral pattern pot for him. He's clearly become obsessed with spirals and says he's been collecting all sorts of spiral-shaped objects. He finds the spiral to be very mystical, like nothing else in nature, and there's just something really creepy about this dude. Later, Kirie tells Shuichi about it, and he seems pretty distressed about the whole thing. He explains that his father stopped going to work and instead just stares at spirals all day. Weirder than that, apparently he gets into a bizarre trance and his eyes begin to spin around independently of each other. He also won't eat a soup until he spins it into a spiral, and he does the same to the bath before he gets in. Kirie just giggles at the peculiarity of Shuichi's father, but he says it's not funny. As the couple continue walking through town, Shuichi points out more of the strange spirals, like the unusual amount of whirlpools in the stream or whirlwinds that keep popping up. Suddenly they hear yelling and rush to Shuichi's place where they find his parents fighting. I guess Shuichi's mother threw away his father's spiral collection and he's pretty pissed off. He then says he doesn't need the collection anymore and that he's learned to express the spiral through his own body. He takes off his glasses and one at a time he begins to move his eyes in a fast spiral motion. It's quite disturbing, especially since both eyes are moving independently. A few days later, Kirie's father asks her to deliver the spiral pot to Mr. Saito. However, when she arrives, he says that he no longer needs it, saying that he can summon the spiral within himself. And as a demonstration, his tongue enlarges and extends from his mouth and then coils into a giant spiral. Kirie understandably runs away screaming. A few days after this, Mr. Saito died. The story goes that he fell down the stairs, but at the funeral, Shuichi reveals the true story to Kirie. Him and his mother couldn't find his dad anywhere until they came upon a large tub in his study that wasn't there before. They removed the top to find a horrific and disgusting sight. Shuichi's father's body contorted into a spiral in the tub. It is one of the most standout images in these first few chapters. As Shuichi is telling the story, the other funeral attendees gasp and point to the sky, which leads us to Chapter 2, The Spiral Obsession, Part 2. Out of the crematorium chimney rises the ashes of Shuichi's father, but as they fill the sky, they begin to form a large spiral. It then begins to funnel down into Dragonfly Pond, a body of water right behind Kirie's house in the center of town. Shuichi's mother cries out in terror as she sees her husband's face in the ashes. She breaks down into full hysterics and they rush her to the hospital. The hospital staff tries to calm her down, but when she notices one of the nurse's hair is in a bun, she freaks out, seeing it as a spiral. From then on, Shuichi's mother developed an extreme phobia of spirals. She becomes terrified of curling hair, so she shaves her head. And worse than that, one day she realizes her fingerprints have spirals in them, so she grabs a pair of scissors and cuts the skin off of her fingertips and toes. Man, my fingers hurt just looking at this. In every spiral, she sees her dead husband. He calls out to her, asking her to join him in the spiral. Shuichi is forced to wear a hat and gloves when visiting her so that she doesn't see the spirals in his hair or fingers. He has a talk with his mother and the doctor doctor's office when he suddenly realizes a human anatomy chart on the wall. Looking closer, he sees a breakdown of the inner human ear. More specifically, he notices the cochlea, which happens to be shaped like a spiral. He rushes his mother out of the room before she sees the poster. If she were to realize there was a spiral within her body, who knows what she might do. That night, as Mrs. Saito sleeps, a large centipede crawls onto her bed and begins to climb into her ear. She smacks it onto the floor where it begins to coil up into a spiral. Looking closer, she sees her husband within the shape. He calls to her again, telling her to join the spiral. He tells her there are still spirals in her body and that he wants to crawl deep into her ears so badly. Shuichi and Kyrie visit the next day, and Mrs. Saito keeps asking if there was a spiral in the human ear. They tell her no, but she's determined to find out, so she rushes to the doctor's office to try and find the chart of the human body, but luckily he'd already removed it. That night, Mrs. Saito sees a whirlpool form in her IV drip. It takes on the shape of her husband's face, who tells her that there are spirals in her ears. She smashes the IV container and pulls the needle out of her arm, only for the tube to fall perfectly into a spiral on the floor. However, she still hears her husband's voice in her ears and decides she must get the spirals out. She grabs a pair of scissors and shoves them into her ear. On the next page, we see Mrs. Saito's head now covered in bandages. She not only destroyed her eardrums, but disrupted her sense of balance, giving her constant vertigo, as if spinning in an infinite spiral. She died shortly after, and at her cremation, her ashes circled in the sky like a spiral before descending into Dragonfly Pond. Chapter 3. The Scar. This chapter begins with Kyrie talking about her friend Azami, who's beautiful, though she says she regrets ever meeting her. Azami is always surrounded by guys who confess their love to her. One day, some girls tell Kyrie about a rumor going around that Azami has a bad reputation of getting guys obsessed with her and then dumping them. They also say that she has a strange scar on her forehead that's the source of her power to hypnotize boys. Later, Kyrie does spot the scar on Azami's head. Apparently, Azami has caught wise to the rumor and tells Kyrie to just ignore them. She does explain that the scar has brought her good luck though. She got it while trying to impress a boy when she was younger and ended up falling off the monkey bars and busting her head. Ever since then, she says that she gets any boy she likes, but it must be a coincidence. Kyrie heads off to meet up with Shuichi, and Azami insists that she tag along because she wants to meet him. Kyrie is clearly reluctant, but finally gives in. When they arrive at Shuichi's place, he freaks out at the sight of Azami and tells her to go away. Kyrie apologizes, telling her that Shuichi's been strange lately and that his parents passed away recently. That night, Shuichi and Kyrie talk on the phone. He tells her that something is off about Azami, that looking at her is like looking at a spiral. He goes even further, saying that she is a spiral. After Shuichi hangs up the phone, he suddenly hears his doorbell ring and opens the front door to find Azami. She's pretty salty at the fact that Shuichi is the only boy who's ever rejected her. He says that she's hiding something on her forehead, and she reveals her scar, only now it's taken the shape of a small spiral. He tells her to leave this town as fast as possible, but instead of listening to him, she begins to stalk him. Night after night, she shows up at his house banging on the door. Every boy she meets can't stop thinking about her, but now she can't stop thinking about Shuichi. Kyrie tells her to quit stalking her boyfriend, and Azami just ignores her, saying she likes him too. Suddenly, a whirlwind goes by, blowing Azami's hair back to reveal her scar has grown, and it seems to be digging into her head. The next day, Azami doesn't show up to school, and Kyrie questions what the hell she saw on her forehead. One night, Shuichi calls up Kyrie, saying that a boy named Okada had asked to meet up with him at the park concerning Kyrie. She heads to the park to try and find out what it's all about, but encounters Azami on the street. She's wearing a hat and says that she feels strange, like she can't focus. She asks Kyrie to take a look and removes her hat. This image is one of the most haunting Junji Ito drawings ever and has become iconic in his work, as well as just horror manga in general. Azami's forehead is essentially caved in from the spiral scar, with her eyeball loosely laying in the open wound. Even more disturbing, the spiral seems to suck her eyeball down into her head. Kyrie screams and Azami heads off to the park where Okada and Shuichi are talking. Apparently, this was all a ploy by Azami to lure Shuichi out of his house. She told Okada she would go out with him if he brought Shuichi to her, but now she's like, I don't care what I promised you, I only want Shuichi. Okada's pissed and knocks the hat off her head. Now the spiral hole has consumed her entire face other than her mouth, and she pulls Okada into it, arms first, until he is devoured by the hole. Kyrie shows up to find Shuichi hiding in a tree, and they watch as Asami's body slowly consumes itself until there's nothing left of her. Chapter 4: The Firing Effect. Kirie and her brother Mitsuo watch as another resident's ashes form into a spiral above the crematorium and then fall into Dragonfly Pond. Meanwhile, their father seems obsessed with his work lately, staying up all night watching his pottery in the kiln. Mrs. Goshima goes to check on him and he freaks out, telling her not to look into the kiln. Outside, Kirie notices that the smoke from the kiln is spiraling as well. Later, at a ceramics exhibition in the next town over, Mr. Goshima shows off his new work. All of his ceramics seem to be deformed and covered in spirals. He says that they all looked normal, but once he put them in the kiln, they took strange shapes. This is sometimes called the firing effect, but it doesn't usually form spirals. Someone asks him what kind of clay he used, and he says he prefers to keep that a secret. Back at home, the family has a look as well, and Mitsuo notices what looks like a human face in one of the pots. He then finds another one that looks like a familiar woman's face. Kirie recognizes them. They seem to resemble Shuichi's parents, and even her mother agrees, assuming that her husband did it on purpose, but he claims it's a coincidence. Later, we see Kirie making some food for Shuichi, who has become a complete shut-in, barely eating, and her mother, feeling bad, suggests that they have him over for dinner. Shuichi is reluctant to come because they live so close to Dragonfly Pond, which he says is infested with spirals, but Kirie drags him along anyway. Well, I guess the poor kid was hungry because he starts scarfing down food like he hasn't eaten in weeks. Suddenly, he freaks out while eating some noodles because they're served on one of Mr. Goshima's weird spiral dishes. He asks him where the clay came from, and Mr. Goshima says, Dragonfly Pond. Shuichi runs away like he's gonna barf, and I don't blame him considering the clay from the pond may be made from the ashes of the dead, including Shuichi's parents. Still, Kirie's father continues to pull clay from the pond. He begins to make dozens of ceramics that look normal until he puts them into the kiln. One night, Kirie goes to check on her father, who has fallen asleep. She sneaks a peek into the kiln and sees something terrifying. The clay is taking the shape of dead faces, contorting within the kiln into a spiral, and voices are crying out in agony. One voice in particular is crying out for Shuichi. At this point, Kirie's father wakes up and tells her to go back inside. She just lies in bed, hearing the small screams from the kiln, realizing they're meant to continue burning for the next 4 days. Shuichi calls her out of loneliness, but as they talk, he begins to hear the voices as well through the phone. He hangs up, and soon Kirie hears him arguing with her father outside. He demands to see what's in the kiln, hearing the voices of his parents. Finally, he grabs a large stone and breaks open the kiln. The spirits of the dead fly out, and we see the disturbing human-like ceramics fall to the ground. They writhe around in pain. The whole place begins to light up, and Mr. Goshima seems to snap out of it a little, asking Shuichi if he's alright and then telling him to get to safety. The entire building burns to the ground, luckily unattached to the main house. As the family looks over the rubble, Mr. Goshima begins digging around looking for the ceramics. His obsession continues. Chapter 5: Twisted Souls. Kirie tells us about the strange row houses that are scattered across Kurozu-cho, all run down but still standing. While walking home from school one day, Kirie hears a dispute up ahead. It appears two young lovers are being ripped apart by the girl's family. The brother even socks the poor kid in the face before they drag the girl away. Kirie helps the boy up and recognizes him as Kazunori from her school. He explains that he and the girl, Yoriko, have fallen in love, but their families hate each other and oddly enough live on opposite sides of the same row house. Their families just won't accept them and stop at nothing to keep them apart. Kazunori claims that their family's souls have been twisted by poverty and have become warped. Still a little beat up, Kirie helps him home and meets his family. His father immediately lays in on him, telling him to stay away from Yoriko before cursing the other family. His mother yells loudly that if maybe their son got a job, he wouldn't have time to beat up on her boy. Suddenly through the wall, a voice yells back, "Shut up, bitch, or I'll kill you." Yeah, I guess they can easily hear each other through the walls, only adding to the contempt. They yell back and forth a bit, insulting each other, until finally Kazunori yells out to stop and tells Yoriko he loves her. With tears in their eyes, the young couple tries to meet each other outside, only for their families to pull them back inside. Later, Kirie explains the situation to Shuichi. He says that the reason the families don't get along is because the row house is cursed by the spiral. He believes the old row houses have some key part to play in the town's curse, and everyone in them is doomed. He once again asks Kirie to leave this town with them, but she leaves in a huff, telling him she won't come to him for advice anymore. Kirie goes back to the row house and finds that Yoriko and Kazunori are missing, and their families have split up to try to search for them. They're hiding out in another row house on the outskirts of town, and as they sit together, they spot something strange. Two snakes intertwined into a spiral. At first, it looks like they're fighting, but on a closer look, they seem to be mating. The couple decides that they'll run away together and elope. Outside, Kirie shows up, but unfortunately, so does Yoriko's family. Her father instantly punches out Kazunori, who falls to the ground. Then he grabs his daughter and leaves. Kirie goes to help him up once again, and it's clear his body is twisted in an unnatural way, something Kirie says she doesn't notice at the time. time. Later, it seems Shuichi and Kyrie have made up, and now they've decided to escort the young couple to the station to see them off. When they show up, however, they are on the run. Apparently, their family spotted them leaving. The 4 teens run for it, deciding to head for the beach and circle around to the road out of town. They're stopped at every exit by Yoriko's family, and in a last-ditch effort, the couple runs out to the beach, where they're immediately cornered. It seems they have something else up their sleeve, though, when Kazunori begins to twist his body in an inhuman way. Yoriko begins to do the same, and the two stretch into the sky, reaching out for each other. Their hands clasp and intertwine, followed by their bodies until they are completely twisted up together, much like the snake they saw before. Their families can't separate them, and the couple says they'll never be apart anymore. They then slither into the water and disappear into the sea. The Lost Chapter, Galaxies. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the bonus chapter at the end of the Uzumaki collection. It's not exactly clear when this chapter would have taken place in the story, but it must be somewhere before chapter 6 because Kyrie's hair is still long, which we'll get to later. I decided to put Galaxies right here because it fits well and feels odd tacked onto the end of the video after the story is complete. So let's just get into it. The chapter opens with Shuichi showing Kyrie a galaxy through his telescope. He says that it seems to have just appeared and isn't listed in any book. Kyrie asks her teacher, Mr. Yokoda, to check it out, and he says that he has an amateur astronomer friend who built a small observatory in his house where they can get a better look. The astronomer, Mr. Torino, asks Shuichi the location and sure enough spots it through his high-grade telescope. They need to check in with the National Astronomical Observatory to make sure it isn't registered yet, but this could be a huge discovery. Kyrie says it might even be named the Shuichi Galaxy, but Shuichi freaks out saying he doesn't want to be associated with that thing. The next day, Mr. Yokoda tells the class about the discovery and everyone seems to get the astronomy bug. Kyrie stops by Shuichi's place and he's freaking out saying he can feel radio waves transmitting to him from the galaxy. He says that they're talking to him, trying to send a message. Meanwhile, Torino starts to feel the same sensation. He leaves his observatory and starts making his way into town until he's just outside of Shuichi's house. Strangely enough, Torino begins communicating with Shuichi with his mind using the radio waves, and the two have a discussion. Torino says that the radio waves are telling him to kill Shuichi so he can take the credit for the galaxy discovery, and in turn, Shuichi says that he's being told to kill Torino. Shuichi doesn't listen to the voice, however, and instead tells Torino he can have the credit for the discovery as he doesn't want it anyway. At school, Kyrie hears talk that Torino is taking credit for the discovery, and she tells Mr. Yokoda what she heard. The two of them confront Mr. Torino about the issue, and after a little argument with Kyrie, he tells them how Shuichi gave him the credit. It's clear Torino is losing it a little, seeing himself as this important figure since he can receive the radio waves. Kyrie declares that she won't allow him to take the credit from Shuichi before she leaves. After this, many more galaxies begin popping up, and the whole town is in a frenzy with the new discoveries. They also start fighting with each other over who discovered what. As Kyrie sits in her room, she begins to hear voices being transmitted directly into her head. She can hear the townspeople all arguing about the galaxies. Two individuals in particular start to get violent, and Kyrie can actually see a murder take place down the street as if watching it through a staticky TV. She runs outside to see if it really happened and finds a crowd. They too saw the act through the radio waves, and even weirder, they're all communicating with each other without speaking. Overwhelmed by the many voices, Kyrie walks away to be alone. But through a nearby fence, she can see the silhouette of a figure. It's Mr. Torino brandishing a knife, and somehow she can see him through the fence using the radio waves. She begins to run, and Torino chases her down. She screams, but it's drowned out by the many voices filling the radio waves. Just as Torino pins her to the ground for the kill, Kyrie spots the spiral galaxies all bright and close up, visible to the naked eye. Torino sees them and celebrates. He begins calling out to the sky, asking for the stars to communicate with him. Suddenly, a bright light seems to come from the sky and shine on him. His excitement quickly turns to torment as the light fills his body and his head begins to expand in a grotesque fashion. Soon, it swells up to a massive size and explodes with light, turning into a small galaxy and shooting off into space. We learn that the National Astronomical Observatory could never confirm any of the galaxies, and that after this incident, they were never seen again. And there you have it, Galaxies. Chapter 6, Medusa. The chapter begins with a high school kid falling off the school roof and dying. Apparently he was trying to show off, doing acrobatics on the handrail and slipped. Kyrie notes that surrounded by the crowd, he somehow looked content, even in death. She discusses the incident with her friend Sekino, and she says she actually knows how the kid felt, always wanting attention, since she also enjoys being noticed. In fact, Sekino says she craves attention lately. Kyrie talks with Shuichi about it later, and he has an interesting theory. Of course, course, it involves the spirals. A spiral can mesmerize people by drawing in their gaze, and attention seekers strive to do the same. The next day, Kyrie notices her hair has grown quite a bit lately, and when she arrives at school, it seems like everyone's staring at her. She turns around to find that her hair is curled up in the back. She can't get rid of them and decides to braid her hair. However, in class, her hairband shoots off and the braids unravel, quickly turning back into spirals. As a last resort, she goes to the hair salon and asks the hairdresser to cut them off, but before she can, Kyrie's hair wraps around the woman's arms and knocks her back. Her hair then sticks up, floating around the room. Kinda reminds me of XD hair extensions. After this, Kyrie's hair continues to grow at an alarming rate, and anytime she tries to cut it off, it begins to choke her. The hair just floats around, displaying its curls, mesmerizing everyone who sees them, including her parents. At school, her hair begins to get even more wild, trying to draw in a bigger crowd of onlookers. It even forces Kyrie to stand at the train station in order to gain a larger audience. Meanwhile, it seems the hair is draining her strength as well. Then Sekino shows up, and it seems her hair has taken on the same spiral curse. She tells Kyrie that she won't lose to her, and from that day on, the school has become a battleground, with the two girls' hair fighting for attention. At this point, the girls are both looking sickly, and Sekino straight up tries to choke Kyrie with her hair. Shuichi shows up and cuts Sekino's hair off of Kyrie's neck, but before he can chop her hair off, he's engulfed by it as if in the belly of a snake, and Kyrie collapses to the ground. Sekino is now looking demented and gleefully basks in her victory. Shuichi hasn't given up, however, and comes cutting his way out of the hair and then cutting it off Kyrie's head. She seems exhausted, and Shuichi pieces together that the hair was draining her energy. In the center of town, Sekino continues flaunting her hair, and at this point, she almost looks like a zombie. She begins to realize what's happening to her body, but it's too late. She grabs onto a nearby pole for support, and the life is completely drained from her body. Her hair lived on for a few hours after this, displaying itself on the telephone pole. Chapter 7, Jack in the Box. There's a kid in school named Mitsuru who loves to jump out and scare people. In fact, everyone calls him the Jack in the Box. He's pretty annoying, and unfortunately, he has a crush on Kyrie. On her walk home after school, Kyrie and her friend Shiho pass through the cemetery. Shiho says that they've begun to bury people again instead of burning them because of what's been happening at the crematorium. They get creeped out talking about it, and just then, Mitsuru jumps out and scares the living daylights out of him. The girls tell him to buzz off and that Kyrie already has a boyfriend. Mitsuru's like, oh, that Soichi guy? Forget him, he's a drag. He says he wants to have a pretty girlfriend like Kyrie and surprise everyone, but she tells him to leave her alone. After this, the Jack in the Box continues to jump out and surprise Kyrie before asking her out. He even has a gift sent to her house. She's fed up and tries to return the gift to Mitsuru. She tells him flat out that the more he pesters her, the less she likes him. He decides maybe he needs to find a different approach and says that he saw something like this on TV before he jumps out in front of a car. He says, my love will stop this car, and the next thing we know, he's dead. The car ran him over and the poor kid got all jammed up in the tire. It's pretty disturbing. Apparently they had to use a blowtorch to extract the body, and it's no surprise that it's a closed casket funeral. Kyrie is feeling a little guilty for Mitsuru's death when she remembers the gift that he gave her. Out of curiosity, she opens it up and finds it's a Jack in the Box. She calls up Shuichi for comfort, and he tells her that it wasn't her fault. Then, from inside of her room, another voice speaks up saying, it is your fault. She turns around to see the Jack in the Box staring at her with an evil face saying, he died for you, didn't he? And now he'll come back for you. That night, Shuichi and Kyrie enter the graveyard. Shuichi says he's going to hammer a stake into Mitsuru's corpse so he doesn't come back. At this point, nothing is unbelievable in this town. They find his grave and dig up his coffin, but suddenly the casket window opens up and Mitsuru's head pops out. Next, his body breaks open the casket and stands up. It's a grotesque image because of the fact that his body was clearly stitched back together after the accident. The couple runs for their lives and Mitsuru jumps after them, leaping with inhuman agility through the air. At one point he lands and his entrails just bust out of his skin, followed by his leg falling off. It's absolutely revolting. He loses his second leg and collapses into the dirt. It seems like it's over when, nope, he's back up again, and now he's jumping after them as only a torso. Even more disturbing, a giant spring protrudes out and he is now bouncing after them just like a Jack in the Box. He goes for a final jump right toward them, but they dodge just in time for Mitsuru to smash into the ground. The spring rolls out of his body and Shuichi recognizes it as a car suspension spring, implying that it was lodged into his body during his death. Chapter 8, The Snail. This might be my favorite chapter of the manga, I'm not gonna lie. On a rainy day, one one student, Katayama, shows up late. He says he got up really early, but it just took a while. He's also soaking wet. Apparently this kid only shows up on rainy days and is always late. He moves incredibly slow, and during a school game of volleyball, his slow reaction costs his team the game. Some of the other boys in class aren't too happy about it and beat him up in the locker room. Worse than that, they strip him naked and pull him out into the hallway for everyone to see. It's pretty messed up. As he lay there naked on the floor, the other students notice he has a strange spiral pattern on his back. He just crawls away like a slug. It's still raining the following day, and Katayama shows up late again, only this time the spiral on his back is swollen and protruding. The next day it's even bigger, and the day after things get much more disturbing. Katayama opens the door to the classroom, but this time he crawls in. His swollen back has become a large snail shell, and his body has begun to transform. Everyone just sits terrified as he crawls onto his desk. Finally, on Friday, Katayama is spotted outside crawling on the side of the school in the rain. He now completely resembles a giant snail other than his head, which is still humanoid, but not for long. His eyes begin to pop out of his head and his transformation is now complete. Kirie declares that he's cursed by the spiral. The staff try to decide what to do and finally call his parents to the school, but they just can't accept that this is their son. Eventually, the school begins to take care of him, keeping him in a cage and feeding him. The bully from earlier, Sumura, just laughs and pokes Katayama with a stick. Whenever the rain stops, Katayama retreats into his shell. Meanwhile, Sumura finds that he's been super thirsty lately. He also finds himself moving really slow, and eventually he even stops showing up to school. Meanwhile, Kirie and Shiho feel bad and decide to spray some water on Katayama. As they do, he pokes his head out of his shell, and it just freaks the girls out, so they run away. Later, the teacher, Mr. Yokota, tells them that it seems Sumura has gone missing, and anyone who knows where he is should speak up. Kirie is watching the rain when suddenly a snail person appears outside the window, only it's not Katayama. It's his bully, Sumura. They stick him in the cage with Katayama, and even though before they hated each other, they seem to be getting along just fine as snails. Too fine. In fact, they begin to mate. A few weeks after this, the two snails have dug out of their cage. Kirie and Shiho, along with their teacher, Mr. Yokota, decide to follow their snail trails which lead into the woods. They soon discover that the snails have laid eggs, and Mr. Yokota begins to smash them up, saying this is unnatural. After this, they search for the snails, but never found them. A few days after this, however, Mr. Yokota came to class late and is now mostly transformed into a snail person himself. Chapter 9, The Black Lighthouse. One night, the lighthouse on the cape of Kurozucho suddenly emitted a bright whirling glow that shot out like tornadoes, and it continued to do so every night at dusk. At dinner in Kirie's house, her brother Mitsuo talks about how cool the lighthouse is, and both Kirie and her mother warn him not to go near it and not to stare at the light. Later, some town officials go to investigate the lighthouse right before sunset, only to never come back, and residents who stare at the mesmerizing light seem to be acting strange, like walking in circles repeatedly and not being able to stop. A fishing boat also capsized near the lighthouse, being drawn in by its light. Mitsuo and his friends want to get a closer look at the crashed boat, and while they're at it, they decide they might as well explore the lighthouse too. Kirie tells them to stop, but the kids go in anyway. She follows after them, climbing the winding stairs to the top of the lighthouse, which seem to go on forever. As she gets closer to the top, spiral patterns begin to appear on the walls and floor, and she can smell burning. As she rounds the next corner, she finds 3 charred corpses. After a moment, she realizes that these are adult bodies and must belong to the officials that went missing. She climbs further to find 2 of the kids sitting in terror on the steps, as well as 2 more bodies, but Mitsuo and the other boys aren't with them. Kirie finally makes it to the top of the lighthouse, where she finds the 2 remaining boys. She also sees the giant lamp has been melted into a strange spiral. It seems that the entire room has partially melted, and she begins to piece together what this means. She frantically looks out the window and realizes what time it is, as the sun is just about to fully set. She screams at the boys to run. They don't quite make it out when the lighthouse lamp starts up and Mitsuo's friend trips on the stairs. Kirie tries to save the boy, but he's burnt to a crisp by the heat, and she and Mitsuo are blown back by the pressure, barely making it out of the lighthouse alive. To this day, the lighthouse still streams a whirling glow every night. Chapter 10, Mosquitoes. It's summertime, and Kirie has spent most of it in the hospital after the incident at the lighthouse. There's been an unusual amount of mosquitoes plaguing the town, and some have even made their way into the hospital. They tend to fly in spiral patterns, which can cause anyone who watches to fall asleep, leaving them open for bites. Shiho visits Kirie at the hospital, and outside they spot a massive column of mosquitoes spinning around like a twister. Shiho says she's seen this a lot lately and that they breed in Dragonfly Pond. Nearby in the bushes, they spot something much worse, a woman's corpse with hundreds of holes in her body. They alert the authorities, and later Kirie overhears the hospital staff mention that 11 people have been hospitalized from mosquito attacks, and they all happen to be pregnant as well. They wheel in one of the victims, and Kirie recognizes her as her cousin Keiko. Kirie checks in on her cousin and helps her unpack her belongings. She finds a heavy device all wrapped up, and Keiko doesn't say what it is, but just to leave it in the nightstand. The next morning, 2 male patients were found dead in their ward. Like the body found outside, they each have dozens of holes in them, as if their blood had been drained. Kirie discusses what happened with Keiko, and she says she didn't hear a thing the night before. That day, Shuichi shows up to visit Kirie and begs her to check out of the hospital immediately, saying that there's something wrong about this place. A nurse then enters the room, saying that Kirie will have to share her room with Keiko as they've run out of room in the maternity ward. Shuichi tells Kirie that he gets a strange feeling from Keiko and that she shouldn't let her stay. Suddenly, a mosquito flies in and Shuichi freaks, pulling out some bug spray and killing it. He then ominously comments on how only female mosquitoes suck blood and only when they're carrying eggs, as the blood helps them develop. Well, the nurse isn't too happy about him spraying bug spray in the hospital and kicks him out. As they drift off to sleep, Kirie warns Keiko about another mosquito in the room, but she just says she doesn't mind them. In fact, she says she likes them a lot, with creepy glazed over eyes. Kirie wakes up in the middle of the night to a strange buzzing sound. She looks out of her room to see a group of pregnant women walking down the hallway. Something is definitely wrong here. These women look freaky and they're all carrying hand drills. They all enter different rooms on the ward, and Kirie follows behind to see what the hell they're doing. She looks in on one room to find a pregnant woman drilling a hole in a patient's neck and then sucking the blood out. The woman notices Kirie watching her and says, "You saw," while chasing her down to the ground. Before the woman can hurt her, a patient comes out of his room wondering what's going on, and the pregnant women all surround him. The woman who chased Kirie makes a spiral shape in the air with her finger and hypnotizes the man, saying, "Give us blood." He passes out and all the ladies pounce on him, drilling holes in various parts of his body to drink from. A nurse is alerted by the noise and comes in to find this freak show. Of course, the poor girl becomes their next victim. It's pretty brutal. They drill into her face and everything, while Kirie just cowers in the corner. Well, I guess they've decided they've had their fill for the night and start heading back to their rooms until the one woman remembers about Kirie seeing her. The entire group of pregos start to chase her, and she locks herself back in her hospital room. As they taunt Kirie through the door, she screams for help, and behind her, Keiko approaches with her own drill in hand. I guess now we know what was in the wrappings. She joins in, saying, "Give me your blood," and at the same time, the rest of the women barge in. Kirie looks around and sees Shuichi's bug spray still on the ground. She grabs it and sprays it at the women, who have a severe reaction and run away. The next morning, no one had any suspicion that the massacre was done by the pregnant women, and the drills were hidden away. But these women nourished their unborn children with blood, and soon they would be born. Chapter 11, The Umbilical Cord. The pregnant women were all approaching the end of their pregnancies, and Keiko is due to deliver her baby first. Kirie tried telling the staff about what she witnessed the night of the massacre, but no one believed her. Even her family doesn't buy it. Kirie is scared of what a baby nourished by human blood might look like, but to her surprise, the baby's as cute and sweet as any other. Soon the rest of the babies are born too, and they're all completely adorable. Kirie gets discharged from the hospital, and on her way out, she says goodbye to Keiko and her baby. She notices something strange though. The baby's belly seems to be swollen. When she mentions this, Keiko and the other women give her an alarming look, and Kirie notices the other babies' bellies are all puffed up too. They begin to cry in unison, and it hurts Kirie's ears. She runs away and accidentally falls down the stairs. As she lay once again in the hospital bed, her family scolds her for getting hurt the day she was finally released. But at least she didn't break anything and should only be in for a few more days. Kirie mentions to the doctor that her ears keep ringing. She says she can hear the sound of the baby's crying spinning in her head. The nurse brings her food later, and there are some strange mushrooms mixed in. Soon the strange fungus becomes a common ingredient in the hospital's food, and the other patients rave about it to the point of being kinda creepy. Kirie walks down the hall past the nursery, and to her shock, she begins to hear the babies communicating with each other. They speak about how wonderful the womb is and how they can't wait to go back. Suddenly one of the baby's belly starts to break out of his shirt and rise up. It's actually a strange spiral fungus attached to the top of his umbilical cord like a mushroom. Truly bizarre. She runs away assuming she she's seeing things when she hears the cries of her cousin coming from the delivery room. She walks inside to find dozens of spiral mushrooms growing out of the floor. She finds the doctor, who's sporting a demented look and talking about how these babies want to stay fetuses forever, and how no matter how many times you cut their umbilical cords, they grow back. He explains that these mushrooms are actually placentas. He says they taste delicious and seem to revitalize him as he goes in for a bite. Kyrie asks what the hell happened with her cousin, and the doctor simply replies that the procedure went well. She barges into the next room, where she finds Keiko with her stomach bulging as if pregnant and a giant scar stitched up down the middle. Apparently the doctor had returned the baby back to the womb. I mean, what the hell? Keiko immediately begins asking for blood to nourish her baby, and her tongue shoots out of her mouth in a twisted, hairy spiral like a mosquito's. She uses it to drain the blood from the doctor, and Kyrie runs for it. She runs through the fungus-filled room, and her cousin comes chasing after her. Honestly, this woman is one of the most disturbing things in this manga. At the same time, other patients begin making their way into the room, having found the mushroom jackpot, and Keiko uses it as an opportunity to suck their blood. Kyrie escapes the hospital and never goes back. Chapter 12, The Storm. The chapter begins with Kyrie and Shuichi sitting on the beach. Kyrie says that if it wasn't for him, she would have died a long time ago. Shuichi is not looking too good. It looks like he hasn't slept in quite a while. The couple then begins to hear an ominous sound coming from the sea, and Shuichi shoots up saying that a storm is coming. He acts like he's been waiting for this to happen and runs through the town warning everyone of the oncoming typhoon. The residents all look at him like he's a whack job, but sure enough, later on the news, the weather warns of a hurricane forming just outside of Kurozucho. Kyrie goes out to deliver Shuichi's lunch and is hit with a strong wind, blowing her umbrella away. She looks up to see what looks like the eye of the storm and rushes back inside. That night, it almost sounds like the storm is calling her name. She wakes up the next morning and it seems the storm's over. However, when she opens her window, she looks up to see that the hurricane is seemingly hovering over her house. Later, she goes out to bring Shuichi his food and she finds him in the street. He berates her for walking around carelessly and tells her that the storm is actually following her. He grabs her arm and tries to drag her to safety, with the storm following suit and throwing a large tree at them. They run for their lives as everything around them is torn up by the hurricane, and Kyrie gets pinned by a falling piece of debris. Another woman shows up and asks if they need help, but she's sucked up into the storm. Apparently, it mistook the poor girl for Kyrie because of their similar raincoats. The girl is hurled into the sky and then slammed back onto the road, killing her instantly. Shuichi and Kyrie manage to hide under an overpass where the storm can't see them, but soon a traffic mirror stabs into the ground beside them, and the storm uses it to see them. That's one clever storm. They climb into a nearby storm drain, but it's no use. The water inside forms a whirlpool and pushes them out into the hurricane. Sometime later, Kyrie and Shuichi were found in Dragonfly Pond, miraculously having survived. It seems the hurricane itself was drawn into the pond, and it appears another typhoon is approaching from the sea. Chapter 13, The House. We learn that most of the town was devastated by the storm, especially the residents surrounding Dragonfly Pond. This of course includes the Goshima family home, but somehow they've all survived. Now they must find somewhere to live in the meantime. Luckily, because many people have been leaving town, there are some vacant properties available. Turns out the house they're placed in is one of the old row houses that Kyrie mentioned a few chapters ago. Oddly enough, these row houses seem to be untouched by the storm. This particular house has been rumored to be haunted by some kind of monster who only comes out at night. The family isn't too happy about it, but this is the best the town can offer, as there are many other families in need as well. The family introduces themselves to their neighbors, starting with a friendly man next door named Wakabayashi. He tells them that the neighbors on the other side are squatters who moved in before the storm, and they don't answer anyway. Back in their section of the house, Kyrie's father finds that he has a strange spiral-shaped wart on his foot, and through the wall we can see an eye watching Kyrie unbeknownst to her. That night she wakes up to a noise as if someone was wailing in pain. The next day, Mr. Wakabayashi asks if she heard the noise as well, and says that he heard the people who live there are an old woman and her son who has some kind of strange illness. It was likely him crying out in pain, and it's said that he's severely deformed as well, which would explain all the ghost stories. As they speak, the old woman comes out of the house and hangs up some laundry that oddly has holes all over it. The woman stumbles and Kyrie rushes to help her up. On a close look, it seems like the woman's hands have some strange pointed growths, but before she can analyze them any further, the woman runs back inside. That afternoon, they hear the cries of the old woman. Kyrie enters the house to find the old woman weeping, saying that her son has died. We see once again the terrible growths on her body. Kyrie looks into the next room and screams, but we never get a look at what she saw. Soon an ambulance arrives to pick up the body, and Wakabayashi won't stop asking Kyrie what the son's body looked like with no sense of tact. Inside, Kyrie notices that she too has grown some warts on her feet, and her brother Mitsuo has gotten them too. Once again, we see that someone is watching the family through through the wall, only this time the culprit is revealed. It's actually Wakabayashi. That creep is obsessed with Kirie and says he's going to drill some holes by her bed to watch her sleep. He looks down to find that he's begun growing the spiky spirals on his hand. Later we see that Mr. Goshima has the same thing happening to his foot. The warts are growing into little spikes. Kirie recognizes it as the same disease the old woman and her son had. Meanwhile, outside, the second hurricane draws closer to Kurozu-cho. As the days go by, the illness gets worse and spreads all over Mr. Goshima's body. Kirie believes it to be the spiral curse caused by the house itself. Mitsuo then notices something odd happening to the wall. It looks like a series of small spiral horns are growing out of it. The wall breaks open to reveal Wakabayashi, who is now covered in the long, jagged spikes. They're even coming out of his eyes and replacing his teeth. He spots a nearby rat and eats it in front of everyone when he starts making his way towards Kirie, who barely dodges him. She tries to crawl outside as Wakabayashi gets closer and closer. He moves in for the killing blow when suddenly a sharp stick flies through the air and goes right through his neck, killing him. It appears that the heavy winds are what blew the stick into Wakabayashi, but if you look in the bottom panel, you can see the mom right there. And I like to think that Mrs. Goshima is a badass and she just threw the stick to save her daughter's life. Chapter 14, Butterflies. A TV reporter and her crew are traveling through the tunnel to Kurozu-cho to cover the strange events surrounding the town. As soon as they make it out of the tunnel, however, the van is hit with a whirlpool, knocking it upside down. The reporter manages to survive and crawls out of the wreckage, but it appears her crew is now dead or severely injured. As she enters Kurozu-cho, the reporter notes that the air is really heavy, and then she sees the pure devastation of the town, which is now in complete ruins. She looks up to see a TV helicopter flying over the sky, only to be hit by a giant whirlwind and destroyed. She walks through the town looking for help and finds a series of corpses in the rubble. Nearby, she finds 3 young boys tied to stakes with their mouths covered. Wondering why anyone would do this to children, she unties them. They don't even say thank you and immediately walk to a nearby house that somehow survived. Then they all start blowing and create a massive whirlwind that destroys the house. They laugh at their handiwork and then turn to the reporter. They say she sucks and decide to get rid of her. One kid just swings his arms and it creates another whirlwind, knocking the woman to the ground. The boys continue to mess with her, blowing more tornadoes at her. They move in for the killing blow and the woman screams out no. Somehow this creates a whirlwind as well and blows the 3 boys away. Someone approaches her from behind and it's Kirie and Mitsuo. Kirie recognizes the reporter as Chie Maruyama, who she'd seen on the news. She explains to Chie that they are currently scavenging for food and for her to be quiet, as any sudden moves or loud noises create immense whirlwinds ever since Dragonfly Pond swallowed up the hurricanes. The whole thing reminds Chie of the butterfly effect, the tiniest flapping of a butterfly's wings causing a hurricane on the other side of the world. Kirie leads her to their row house, which is impervious to the whirlwinds for some reason. She mentions that the last row house they were in was infected, but this one is safe. They head inside to find the place is chock full of people. Chie asks if anyone would be willing to come help see if her crew has survived, and everyone says no, other than the Goshimas, who offer to help her. Some cynical man chimes in saying that it's useless, there's no getting out of Kurozu-cho, and that many of the people trapped in here are reporters, rescue team members, and volunteers. They've all been sucked into the spiral. The Goshimas and Chie begin to head out, but they encounter 2 of the boys from earlier. The boys say that Chie killed their friend with the twister she made, and they're here for revenge. They start to blow, and everyone runs inside where the twister has no effect. The boys just keep trying to blow the house down until finally the people in the row house all blow back, sending the kids flying. In the corner, Shuichi is mumbling to himself that the town is finally turning into a spiral, and outside the boys have survived the twisters. In fact, now they're riding on them. Chapter 15, Chaos. Now that people have learned how to fly on twisters, there's a gang flying around the town destroying all the remaining buildings. Mitsuo says it looks fun and that he wants to join, but Kirie reminds him how dangerous it is and that many people have died trying to ride whirlwinds. Kirie, Mitsuo, and Chie continue to scavenge for food, and suddenly Chie screams, creating a huge twister. Kirie is like, I know you're new here, but can you fucking be quiet, please? Turns out that Chie was frightened by several massive snail shells. Kirie explains casually that these are snail people, and as she explains the phenomena, the snails come out of their shells and begin to crawl. Their faces still slightly resembling humans. When they return to the row house, it's clear it's become even more crowded, with some people resorting to sitting up on the support beams. One of these people finds an old scroll hidden in the wall. He drops it and it unravels on the floor, showing what looks like an ancient map of the town, only there's a massive spiral in the center. The guy who dropped it starts yelling that he wants it back, and arguments are breaking out everywhere, including one guy who's sick of Shuichi muttering to himself. He quite literally kicks him out of the row house. Chie and the Goshimas go out to check on him, and the people inside lock them all out, excited for the extra space. They discuss whether they should try to escape. Chie said she tried exiting through the tunnel she came through, but it seemed to go on endlessly. As they talk about their options, Mitsuo starts smelling something really good. He follows the scent to find the gang members from earlier cooking something over a fire. Mitsuo is determined to ask them if he can have some, and despite Kirie's warnings, he approaches the fire. As he moves in closer, it becomes clear what the men are cooking. Mollusk people. They break open one of the roasting shells and begin eating the meat that pours out. We can still see the resemblance of a human face and teeth in it. The gang leader says the kid can have a bite if he wants, and that snail people are actually delicious. He offers it to Kirie and Chie as well, taking notice of their good looks and saying that they can have as much as they want if they stick with the gang. Kirie's father tells them to buzz off, and the gang leader sends him flying with a twister. In retaliation, Kirie shoves the gang, sending them off into the air. However, they begin riding the whirlwinds and chasing after the group. Kirie and Chie get sent up into a whirlwind and are suddenly hurling towards Dragonfly Pond along with all the gang members. It seems that the pond is drawing them all in. A mysterious hand then reaches out and grabs hold of Kirie and Chie. As the gang is pulled into the pond, we see that the girls have been saved by Shuichi, who has a firm hold on a telephone pole. I love Shuichi, even if he has gone insane. Chapter 16, Erosion. As the chapter opens, we see that more and more people have been flooding into Kurozu-cho, only to find themselves trapped inside, and that the whirlwinds have increased, making the town more dangerous as well. Kirie, Chie, and Shuichi run into another group of survivors led by two men named Tanizaki and Takamoto. They say that they thought about escaping by sea, but noticed that a whirlpool sucked in any boats trying to escape. They decide to band together and try to head for the outskirts of town, hopefully finding an empty row house. As they walk, they notice one of the men in the group, Okamoto, isn't feeling well. They pull up his shirt to find that he has a shell forming on his back and is turning into a mollusk person. Everyone starts looking at their backs and they find one more dude with a spiral pattern on his back as well, although the shell hasn't formed yet. As they get toward the edge of town, they find one of the row houses, but it seems packed full of people. There are some survivors trying to force their way in, but the people inside keep blowing them back. Finally, they bust the door open and see the monstrosity that's inside. The people of the row house are crammed together so tight that they've begun to twist together into knots, forming a massive blob of humans. It's so tight that they bust out of the sides of the row house. However, they start using nearby materials to simply expand it. It's both bizarre and terrifying. The crew decides whether it would even be a good thing to get into a row house if this is what they would become. Then one of them spots incoming rescue ships. They begin to celebrate too soon, however, as the ships are all sucked into a giant whirlpool in the sea. After nightfall, the group complains about how hungry they are when they run into one of the cooked mollusk people. Desperate, Tanizaki, Takamoto, and the rest of their crew begin to eat the giant cooked snail. Tanizaki tries to convince Kirie and Chie to do the same, but they're reluctant to eat something that was once human. However, after they see Shuichi has begun eating the meat, they join in. And in one of the most haunting lines of the manga, Kirie says, "That night, I ate the meat of a snail person." They save the leftovers in a plastic bag and the next day keep traveling through the rubble. Kirie hears a voice crying out to her, and under some debris they find Mitsuo. At least one of her family members has survived. They help get the junk off him, only to reveal that Mitsuo has a shell growing on his back. And Kirie decides at that moment, with both of her parents likely dead and her brother turning into a snail, that she must leave Kurozu-cho. Chapter 17, Escape. Kirie says she needs to get Mitsuo out, hoping he'll return to normal outside of town. They decide to literally head for the hills, hoping to find a trail out, despite Shuichi saying it's no use, and that they are in the spiral now. As they walk the hills and look down on the devastation of the town, they spot Tanizaki on a roof trying to expand a row house. He calls out to them, but his yelling causes a huge twister to fly at them. They realize that Tanizaki isn't alone. All around, the townspeople are expanding the row houses. The crew makes their way into the forest where all the plant life have started to take on spiral shapes. They hear a noise up ahead and find Takimoto and a few members of his crew. They say that they left town in the same way. In fact, they were following behind Kirie a ways off, and it appears that the forest has sent them back toward the town. No matter where they go, all the paths just lead back to the spiral. They decide to all journey together once again, and Kirie notices one of the men, Okamoto, who has the shell forming on his back, is on a lead. Turns out the men are pulling him along so that when he becomes a snail person, they can cook and eat him. I mean, that's fucked up, man. Mitsuo complains that his back itches, and the guys all look at him, piecing together that he too might be becoming a snail. But at that moment, Okamoto drops to the ground and fully transforms. The guys get excited, finally ready to cook poor Okamoto, and as they approach, he hides in in a shell. One of the men is ready to crack it open, but Takimoto stops him, saying it'll create a whirlwind, plus he has an idea. This sick bastard gets down on the ground and shoves his head into the shell, eating the snail raw. It's absolutely disgusting. As the dude continues to eat, his body seems to get sucked into the shell, and while his crew's distracted trying to get him out, Kirie's group decides to sneak away. Now, deep in the forest and lost, they come across a tree stump. Soichi looks at the stump, and in its spiral pattern, he sees an image of his father. They continue walking, but it seems they're moving all the more slow, and when Chie looks at her watch, the hands have turned into spirals. Mitsuo stops and starts eating some of the nearby plants, and Kirie is forced to carry him as he's become too slow. Out of the dark, Takimoto and his two men show up again with a disturbed look on their faces. Takimoto asks why they left him and takes notice of Mitsuo, saying his back looks pretty swollen, but Chie says it's just a backpack. However, at that moment, Mitsuo's eyes pop out of his head. His transformation is almost complete. The girls try and hide his eyes from the men, but it's no use. Mitsuo continues to transform, and the men begin to chase them. What's interesting about this chase scene is, because running can create whirlwinds, everyone's forced to just like speed walk. It's a very tense scene because the people are chasing them, but they're all moving at a snail's pace. No pun intended. They hit a dead end at the edge of a cliff and decide they must let Mitsuo escape by crawling down the side. Mitsuo refuses to leave, and Kirie tells him to go or she'll hit him with a stick. It's honestly the weirdest version of the go on get cliche I've ever seen. Kirie, Chie, and Soichi pretend like they're still carrying Mitsuo to give him time to escape. The men follow behind, discussing whether to eat him raw, and Takimoto goes on a disturbing monologue about how great the sensation of crawling into Okamoto's shell and eating the soft parts of his face was. As he recounts the euphoria, his body begins to twist up into a spiral, followed by the other men. As they leave, Soichi declares that the spiral is now in them. Kirie says that they are near the edge of town now, but they seem to catch sight of something that shocks them. Chapter 18, The Labyrinth. They look down at the town and see that the row houses have now been expanded and connected, forming a massive maze-like spiral. They wonder how the townspeople managed to build all of this so fast, and they conclude that they must have been in the forest much longer than they thought. They speculate that maybe the entire town was once a spiral, much like what they saw on the old map, but over time it decayed and fell apart, leaving only scattered row houses left in seemingly random spots. Now, people in the row houses seem to have subconsciously recreated the spiral structure. Kirie decides she's going into the spiral to try and find her parents, and Chie and Soichi join her. After walking around the outside of the row house, they find the entrance to the alley between the spirals. They notice that inside the alley, they no longer create twisters and can move faster now. They begin to hear voices through the windows of the houses. Kirie approaches a window and asks if anyone has seen her parents. She's greeted by the twisted and disturbing human shapes. They say they know nothing of her parents, but ask if she could do a favor and get rid of what they're about to toss out. The door opens and a person twisted up into a spiral is thrown out onto the ground. They say the man died this morning and that it was an ordeal untangling his corpse from their bodies. Wow, that is a disturbing concept. They just leave and continue down the spiral alley. As they do, they begin to smell something horrible, and the houses begin to throw several more twisted corpses out onto the path. As Kirie and the gang pass by, a face comes to a nearby window and asks if they could take the bodies with them, as the smell is unbearable. Kirie asks once again about her parents, and the figure replies, what would they know about her parents? Up ahead, they see a figure approach. A bearded man is dragging several spiral corpses behind him. When he gets closer, they recognize him as Tanizaki. He says it's been years since he'd seen them and wonders why they haven't changed at all. He tells them that the expansion is nearly complete and that there are only a few gaps left. It appears his job is to clean up the corpses since everyone else has gone inside and twisted together. Kirie asks him if she's seen her parents, mentioning that her father is a potter. Tanizaki says that there actually is a couple who makes pottery down by Dragonfly Pond. Excited, Kirie and the gang move on to Dragonfly Pond, hoping to find her parents, though Tanizaki warns them that there are a lot of deadfalls further on, and even he hasn't made it to the pond. Sure enough, their path is blocked several times, but they are able to make their way through the gaps still left in the spiral. As they pass through, they see the twisted human form still trying to build. At nightfall, they take a break and speculate on why this is happening. Shuichi theorizes that maybe this has happened repeatedly since ancient times. Every few centuries, the spiral returns to haunt this area, and the residents slowly rebuild the town in this shape. If this were the case, how could the story have never lived on? Unless everyone who could have told the tale vanished. Up in the sky, they see a spiral form, and it looks much like that of the crematorium smoke all that time ago. It begins to spiral down, giving them a clue as to the direction of Dragonfly Pond. There's a small gap nearby that they begin to pass through, but the spiral people are actively shutting it up, and Chie is caught in between. They try to help her, but it's no use. She's trapped inside. Voices begin to cry out in different directions that the spiral is complete and fully connected. A large rumbling noise sounds, and something large seems to be moving through the houses toward the center of the spiral. Finally, everything goes quiet. They open a nearby door to check on Chie and find that the row houses have been completely emptied out. They walk through the row house's spiral until they finally reach the center, a large spiraling staircase into the earth where Dragonfly Pond once was. Shuichi says that this must have been at the bottom of the pond all along, and that the row houses must have emptied into it. The cause of the spiral must be down these ancient stairs. Kyrie declares that she's going down there as it's the only place left, and Shuichi grabs her hand, saying they'll both go. The young couple make their way down the stairs into the unknown, and that is the end of the chapter. Chapter 19. Completion. Kyrie and Shuichi make their way down the steps, which seem to go into an infinite spiral. They eventually come upon a twisted body. It seems he was left behind, and as they pass him, he begs them to take him along, saying that there's supposed to be something wonderful at the bottom. They don't have the strength to do so and press on, but the man grabs Kyrie by the ankle and bites her. Shuichi tries to fight him off, and soon the spiraled man latches onto him instead. As the spiraled man wraps his twisted arms around Shuichi, they both go tumbling off the stairs and into the spiral pit. Kyrie cries out after him, now completely alone, but she keeps on moving, running down the steps to find Shuichi. She begins to see a light at the bottom of the spiral, and sure enough, she reaches the bottom. The stairwell ends and drops into a massive room filled with spirals. Below the stairs is a huge drill-like pillar. Kyrie attempts to climb down, but slips. She barely grabs hold of the structure, but can't hold on for long, and goes tumbling off into the unknown space below. She believes she's going to die, but instead her body falls slowly, as if being laid down by a whirlwind. She opens her eyes and finds herself laying on top of hundreds of twisted human bodies. This place seems to go on endlessly, with mesmerizing spirals as far as the eye can see, like a massive city of spirals. The residents of Kurozu-cho all captured by its beauty. Kyrie begins to wander around, calling for Shuichi. She finds that the further she walks, the harder the twisted bodies become, like they're turning into stone. This is when Kyrie discovers her parents turned to stone. She mourns the loss of her mother and father when she hears the voice of someone nearby calling her. It's Shuichi. He tells her to look at the runes, saying they're like a living thing with a will of its own. He believes it's still slowly building itself, whatever it is. He urges Kyrie to go without him as he can't go on. Kyrie says she can't go on either. She's staying with Shuichi. They grab hold of each other's hands, which extend and intertwine, and then they embrace. A loud noise echoes through the infinite spiral hell, and the drill-like structure spirals up, filling the stairwell. The spiral is now complete. Kyrie says that a strange thing then happened. Just as time sped up when they were on the outskirts, in the center of the spiral, time stood still. So the curse was over the same moment it began. The endless frozen moment she spent in Shuichi's arms. And it'll be the same moment when it begins again. When the next Kurozu-cho is built amidst the ruins of the old one. When the eternal spiral awakes once more. And that, my friends, is Uzumaki. Wow, this is one of those stories that just kind of leaves you speechless at the end. It truly is cosmic horror because it hits you with that eerie feeling of the unknown, as well as just the emotions that swell up when these two characters who have been through tragedy after tragedy are forced to throw in the towel, finally succumbing to the spiral curse they've been fighting against. And they do it together. It really is an unforgettable story, and that's why I saved it for last, sort of. Next video, I'll be running through every Tomie story, and I'll wrap the whole thing up with a massive compilation video with the entire Junji Ito Explained series all in one place, so stay tuned for that. Big thanks to everyone for watching. If you like the intro and outro music that's likely playing right now, go check out Kill Me Katie, and of course, big shout out to my patrons. If you want your name displayed at the end of every video like these fine people, consider joining the Patreon. But I appreciate you guys watching at all. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.